Hello, welcome to our 5th Micropole Insight webinar. This webinar is the second webinar of 2 that tell us about CI/CD and how this is organized and done in Azure. This second session will go more in practice with demoing on how to do CI/CD in Azure, and more in particular for Azure Data Factory and Azure SQL databases. If you have any questions, you can always ask them during the session and we will handle them at the end. Okay, so these are the points for today. We are first shortly going to introduce ourselves, who are we? And then there is a practical demo about CI/CD on Azure Data Factory. And afterwards, Glenn will give a demo on CI/CD on Azure SQL database. Okay, my name is Egon van den Rijt. I'm an Azure data architect and data engineer. I'm working with the Microsoft data platform for more than 20 years. I first started as a DBA, and later on I did more and more also BI projects. I'm a father of 2 sons, and if I have some free time, I like playing guitar, playing paddle, and playing around with IoT devices.
Hello everyone, my name is Glenn Daams. I'm an Azure data architect and data engineer. I'm working with the Microsoft data platform for over 6 years now. I'm mainly focused in the business intelligence platform. In my free time, I like to play soccer, and I also like to walk my dog.
So let's now take a look more in detail on how the things are done and the things that are needed to deploy Azure data objects in Azure. When you start with CI/CD the first thing you need to do is to connect to your DevOps environment. If you don't have one of your company, you can always start for free with Azure DevOps. You can generate a free account and use that one. And you can share that environment also with 5 internal users in total. Once you have your Azure DevOps environment, you need to start organizing it. The first thing you need to define is an organization. An organization is an Azure DevOps is a mechanism for organizing and connecting groups of related projects. You can choose one organization for your environment, your entire company, or one organization just for you, or separate organizations for specific business units. This depends a little bit on how your organization is structured. I've been working with different approaches at different clients, and one of the main things to take into account is to know on what level do people and teams want to collaborate and share things. Like, for example, they do want to share boards and tasks. And at what level do they want to completely separate things from each other? Once you've created your organization, you need to define your projects. A project in Azure DevOps contains the following set of features. It contains boards and backlogs for agile planning. It contains pipelines for continuous integration and deployment. It contains also repositories for version control and management of source code and artifacts. And it also has things for continuous test integration throughout the project lifecycle. For each organization contains also 1 or more projects. So yes, this means that a project uses all of the Azure DevOps services. Okay, let's do a quick demo on this part already. So I will share my screen. If you want to log on and to connect to Azure DevOps, you need to go to dev.azure.com. And if you connect the first time, the first thing you need to do is to create an organization. So in my case, I created the Micropole Insight organization. If you want to have an organization per specific team or project, you can create multiple organizations. Within your organization, you can create projects. So on my environment, I have like a test project, I have a Micropole DevOps demo project, a platform project, and so on. If you want to create a new project, you just click on the tap on the button, you say, okay, test project or my test project or whatever for your project. You can choose if it's public, visible, or private. So let's take private. Then it's only for your members. We create it. And once this is created, you will see that you can use that project and start using it. Voila, it's there. Within your project, you then have, of course, your dashboards and all those things, but today we will focus most of the times on repositories and pipelines. If you want to start using the repositories, the first thing you need to do is to initialize it. To do this, it's a best practice to add a README file and also to ignore the Visual Studio, well, like it's here, the Visual Studio files, to not take them into account for the versioning. Well, if you click on the initialize button, then we can start adding files and adding folders on our project. Okay. So once you've set up your Azure DevOps environment and linked it to Git, you can start with using the repositories to store your platform level objects, your resources like Azure Data Factory, Azure SQL Database, Azure Functions, and some more. And on the other side, you can also add your project level code that you need. In the webinar of today, we will focus ourselves on the project level CI/CD, which is in most cases separated from the platform level CI/CD. And that platform level CI/CD is in most cases done and managed by an infrastructure team. If you take a look at the Azure Data Factory CI/CD flow, we see that this has a specific flow. In Azure, most of the resource types have their own specific needs, which makes it also that the way of doing the CI/CD is a little bit different in each case. But the overall general principles of developing, creating artifacts, and then deploying them to different environments remains, of course, always the same. Okay, so if you look at the picture, we have, in this example, we have a development Azure Data Factory. We have a QA, but it can also be a test or a UAT Azure Data Factory, and a production data factory. Our development data factory, it will be linked to our Git repository. So if only the dev environment will be linked, and afterwards we will see that these artifacts that are generated, that we can then afterwards publish them and deploy them to the other environments. If you, for example, want to make some changes on your data factory, the first thing you normally do is create your side branch. It can be a dev branch, or you can give it your own name. You develop it, and once it's developed, you perform a pull request, and a pull request will merge your dev branch with the master branch of Azure Data Factory. Once that merge is done and validated, you did some tests, then you do a publish, and that publish will push or publish the master repository to the ADF publish branch on your Git. The Git can, in our demo, it will be DevOps Git, but it can also be GitHub or another Git if you want. Once you have your Azure Data Factory publish repository, so the ADF publish, it has the artifacts already inside it. And then you can create pipelines to deploy further your artifacts to your other environments, like, for example, to your QA environment or your production environment. In our demo of today, we will have an MPI webinar D ADF environment, so a development Azure Data Factory. We will have also a test, a T ADF, and we will have an MPI DevOps demo repository where we will push our code to, publish our code to then afterwards further deploy it. And we will create release pipelines to deploy that code, that artifacts to our test environment in our case. Okay, so let's now start the demo. I will go back to my other screen. Voila. So as I explained to you, we will have two environments. This will be my DADF, so my development Azure Data Factory. And I have a second Data Factory, which is a T, webinar T, ADF, which is a second instance of Data Factory. We have our repository, so I have my MPI DevOps demo repository. And within that repository, I have two branches. I have my ADF publish branch, which is linked to the Azure Data Factory. And I have also my master branch, where I can put some scripts or other code that I will execute. For example, for Data Factory, I have some pre and post tasks that I need to do. It's a PowerShell script. It can be PowerShell, Python, .NET, any other language. A lot of possibilities that you can perform. On our development Data Factory, of course, we need to link our Azure Data Factory to the Git. So we see our Git configuration. And for our repository type, we see it's a Azure DevOps Kit. So in our case, we took Azure DevOps Kit. And it is linked to the MPI DevOps demo repository. Okay, so this is linked. So if we do some changes on our Azure Data Factory, it will automatically, if we push the publish button, it will automatically be deployed to our ADF publish branch, the one I showed in the overview. And there we will have two templates. We have one ARM template for factory, which contains all information of the pipelines, data sets, all those things. And then we have a second one, which only contains the parameters. And this one can be used to afterwards also overrule the parameters if you want to deploy. So this is already set up by default by configuring our Azure Data Factory. The next thing we need to do is to create a release pipeline. So therefore we go to pipelines, releases, voila. And then we can say create a new pipeline. I'm in my test project. Let me go to the right project, close this one. Leave this. Okay, so I go to the MPI DevOps demo because there my Azure Data Factory is linked with that repository. Okay, I say create new pipeline. No, not here. Needs to be a release pipeline. Sorry. So new release pipeline. That's what we need. And I will start from an empty job. You can already use some templates, but I will start from an empty job. Okay. And then we have our artifacts where we can base ourselves on, and afterwards we will define some tasks to perform. So the first thing I want to do is to add an artifact. So for our Azure Data Factory, we will use in this case our Azure repository. You can do it also based on a build or on a GitHub, or there are some more options to do. If you want to delay it, you can talk about it afterwards. But in this case, we will use the Azure repository. Then we need to specify which repository. So the project is on the DevOps demo project. And there we need to take the DevOps demo repository. Within that repository, we have two branches, as I explained to you, the master branch and the ADF publish branch. So the first one we want to add is our ADF publish, the one that is directly linked to our Azure Data Factory. We will use the latest version and we can give it an alias, like for example, MPI demo _ADF to know that it's about the ADF the artifact. Then we need to add a second one. And the second one is for our master branch, because also we want to perform scripts, in our case, the PowerShell script that I mentioned over here. So the one that is shown over here. So we will also execute this pre and post deploy tasks. It's a PowerShell. So those ones are on the same project. It's on the same repository, also MPI DevOps demo, but it's a different branch. It's our master branch. We also take again the latest version and we give it an alias _master, for example. Okay, so now we have our two artifacts. Now we need to define what are the tasks that we want to do. So we click on this button. We can say add a task. And then the first thing we want to do is to call the Azure PowerShell script to do the stop triggers and the start of the triggers. So it's an Azure PowerShell task in this case. In this task, we can give it a name. So we can say, first we need to stop our triggers, our ADF triggers, before we deploy everything. Voila. I need to say on which subscription it is. I need to define the path of the script. So this one is on the master branch. It was on the factory, and then it was the ADF pre-post deploy PowerShell. Voila. I also need to provide some script arguments, because by default, the script can stop, can start, and can do some other things. So I already prepared for the demo in detail the parameters. Well, let me put it here. So it has some default parameters. It needs the path where our template is stored, and then the factory name, and then the pre-deployment and delete deployment parameters. So for our stop triggers, the delete deployment will be false. For the start triggers, it will be true. I already prepared the complete string, so I don't have to type everything myself to speed it a little bit up. So everything is filled in. We can double check it to see that everything looks well. That's okay. If some error occurs, we can just leave it by default that it needs to stop. And then for the PowerShell version, we can say, okay, take the latest one. If you have a script that needs a specific older version, then you need to specify your version. Okay, we will save this under the root path. So I have a stop triggers that I want to do before the deployment. The second thing, after the deployment, I want to start the triggers again, the ADF triggers again. So I clone this one. We can rename it and say this is the start triggers. All the other parameters are the same. The only thing that is different is that the delete deployment is set to true instead of false. Voila. So we can save this one too. Then, of course, we stop and start the triggers. What we need to do is, of course, to deploy our Azure Data Factory artifacts. So one last task we need to add, and it's based on an ARM, because that's what Azure Data Factory by default creates. So it's an ARM template deployment. We can add it. You can always change afterwards the order in which the steps have to be performed. So if they are in the wrong order, you can still drop and drag. There we need to specify, we can say, okay, the display name is okay. We need to specify our connection. We also need to specify our subscription, which is our subscription. Then we need to say, okay, which is the action we want to perform. In our case, it's create and update a resource group. We need to say which resource group it is. In our case, it's the Micropole Insight test environment. And if you take a look at our data factory, this is our test data factory. It is located in the Micropole Insight test resource group. So that's the right one. Then the location of our resource group or our resource. In our case, we use West Europe. But if you are located somewhere else, of course, you can adapt it and put it on a value that is the best for you. Then we need to specify the location of our templates. First, the first one is the one of our ARM template for factory. So the one who has all definitions inside. And the second one is for the template of the parameters. There we go to the ADF repository again, and there we take the template parameters for factory. Of course, if we deploy it like it is now, it will deploy with the name, the Azure Data Factory name we have on development, and it will also use all other parameters as it is on development. Of course, we need to override it. So if you want to know which you need to override, you can always take a look in your repository and I need to go, of course, to my ADF publish repository. And there you will see in the parameters for factory, those 3 parameters are available, so I can put them on another value. So the factory name for our test environment will be TADF. The account, the shared access key for my ADLS connection that I have within Azure Data Factory, I need to specify it. And also the path, the URL to my Azure Data Lake storage, I also need to put it to the right version because this one contains a D which points to the development environment. So I also prepared the connection string for that. So you just take out the parameters that are available for your Azure Data Factory template, because the more resources, the more data sets and so on you have, the more parameters you need to fill in and need to change when you deploy. So in my case, I override the factory name. It's the T one, the test one. I put the connection string there and the shared access key, sorry, and the URL points also to the TADLS. If you need to know those values, you can always go to your subscription. You can go to your storage accounts, and then for the TADLS, for example, you can find the access keys that are over there. Okay, once those are filled in, we need to specify if we want to deploy incremental or do a full complete deploy. In our case, we go for an incremental deploy. We can give it a deployment name, so let's call it ADF test deploy, and then everything is okay. So now our release pipeline is completely created. It contains 2 artifacts and 3 tasks in the job. The next thing we can do or want to do is to specify, okay, when needs this to be triggered, so we can trigger it on our ADF branch of our repository. So let's filter this out. We take the ADF publish and we save it. So this means now that if we do modification on our Azure Data Factory, if we publish it, then automatically our release pipeline will be triggered. So let's go to our development, the Azure Data Factory. Let's say, okay, this is the data flow test data flow name. So we change it, we save it, and then we can publish it. And once we publish it, it checks that it already sees that there are modifications. So we can say, okay. And at this moment, this is publishing the changes to our repository. So if we have a look over here, once the publication is done, then we will see that on this part, voila, it tells us, okay, the ARM template for factory just now, so the modification was done and was published to our repository. In the meantime, we have also our release pipeline that should have been triggered, and voila, it's already running. You see it's blue and those arrows are there. So the release pipeline has been triggered by the publish to the ADF publish, and we can see the details. Let's check for that. Okay, it's a little bit slow, but normally if you click on this tab, it can give you the details. And now my connection is very slow, it seems. Well, I clicked again. Okay, now we have the details. So we see in the meantime, it did already the initialization step. Download the artifacts, stop the triggers. It did the deployment to the test environment. It started the triggers and it finalized this job. We saw quickly still that it was blue and that it finished all steps. If you want to know more about the details, you can always click on it. If we now go to our test environment and we refresh over here, we This is the old value. If we refresh it and we go to the pipeline, voila, then we see it has the same value as it does over here. Voila, this was my demo. Now I will give the word to Glenn, who will give you a demo on how to do CI/CD for Azure SQL databases.
Thank you, Egon, for demonstrating CI/CD for Azure Data Factory. Now let me quickly share my screen. Okay, so now let's have a look on how to deploy Azure SQL DB in Azure with CI/CD. Before we dive into the demo, let me first give you some context on what we are going to do. So first, we are going to import our database in Visual Studio. I have already set up an Azure SQL DB called Webinar Dev, and I have also created an empty Visual Studio database project, which is linked to our repository. Next, we are going to commit and push our changes from Visual Studio to the Git repository. After this, I will show you how to set up CI/CD in Azure DevOps pipelines. We will do this by building a pipeline, of course. Next, we will build a release pipeline, and after this, we will build a release. Then I will trigger the CI/CD pipeline by making some changes in Visual Studio and committing these changes to the Git repository. These changes will then be executed in the production Azure SQL DB, which is called Webinar. So with the context given, let's dive into the demo. So I'm here at the Azure DevOps portal. I'm using the same organization and the same project as Egon was using. And then let's dive in. So I will first show you the setup of the Visual Studio. So as you can see here, we have an empty Visual Studio, which is linked to our repository. And we have also set up the databases in here. So let me just refresh them quickly. And this one as well. And we will open them. And we will see that our production database is empty and that our development database has the tables. So now we want to import our dev database into our project. So you can do that very easy by just importing a database. So we are going to select a connection here, our Webinar Dev. Going to connect. In here, you can set up some settings that you want to change, how that the folder structure is handled. I will leave it all at default, and I will start importing the database. So he was logging onto the Azure service, and he's then creating all the scripts of all the tables, views, everything that you want in here. So it's already finished. So as you can see here, we have the DBO, the tables, and all the tables that we have in the database are here. So now we want to save all of this. Maybe just a really quick show like this. You need to change the target platform. On default, it's not to Azure SQL database. So default, it will be a SQL server. If you're deploying to a Azure SQL database, be sure to change it here. So now we are going to commit our changes. So we're going to do the initial commit. We're going to commit them. And now we are going to sync and we're going to push our changes to the Git repository. So as you can see, our changes has been successfully pushed to our repository. And now we go to our Azure DevOps pipelines and we're going to create a pipeline. So we'll do that here. As you can see here, we got some pipelines set up already. We will start with a new pipeline. Here you can choose whether your code is YAML code or you can go to the classic editor without YAML code. For the demo, I will go to the classic editor. And then here you have to choose your team project, which is the DevOps demo and the repository. I created a different repository from Egon's. So I have the DevOps SQL demo in here and I have just the main branch. So we're going to continue. In here, you can see there are a lot of templates that you can choose of. So a lot of things are available. But for the demo, I'm going to select an empty job because we are going to create everything ourselves. Now we are going to add some tasks in here. So I will just add the task that I need and I will configure them after that. So first we need a Visual Studio build because we want to build our solution. Next, we need a copy files as we are going to copy our deckpack file to our artifacts. And next, we're going to need a publish artifacts. So I will add publish artifacts as well. Now let me go over the configuration real quick. So what I typically do is when I go to the get sources, I always choose to perform a clean deployment. So you can do a clean performance that cleans automatically all the selected options. So in here, you can see which options are available. You can do the sources, you can put the output directory, all the build directories. For the demo, I will choose clean the sources and the output directory. So like this, and for the rest, I leave it at the default. Next, I'm going to build the solution. So for this case, we only have one solution in our repository, so we could leave everything at default. But if you have multiple solutions in your repository, be sure to select your solution with the dots in here. So I navigate to your solution. And I'm going to give it a better name. In here, we can choose the Visual Studio version. For this one, I'm going to leave it at the latest. The same as with Aegon, if you need a specific version, you can always choose it here. But for now, I'll leave it at the latest one. Next, we got the MS Build arguments. This is completely optional, but I'm going to put something in there. So I'll explain later while the run is going on what these mean. Long story short, I just put them there to have less files and to have a faster continuous integration. Next, the platform. So you can choose between some platforms, for example, x86, x64, or any CPU. The default is any CPU, either in Visual Studio and in here. You can leave it blank. You can fill in any CPU. It doesn't change anything. So I'm going to leave it blank just to show that you don't need to fill it in. And then for the configuration, default is debug, but you can also specify release or any other stuff. So in here, as we are going to release something, I will do it in the release configuration. So this is the first task set up. Next, I got the copy files. In here that you can see that you do need to change some settings before you can use it. So this is, I'm going to copy the files. So I'm going to copy the deckpack file. And therefore I need to create a source folder because in the last step in here, I added the release configuration, which is not default. In here, I have to specify that. So I'm going to copy the statement and I'm going to paste it in there. So as you can see, in our solution, there will be a bin folder and default, it will be debug, but now we have release. Next, the contents. So it's the files that we want to copy. You can choose to leave it default and copy everything, or you can say we only want the deckpack file. By doing this, you will limit the files he chooses to copy, and thus the process will go faster. Next, we need a target folder. In here, we are just going to use the default parameter variable that is used there. We're just going to copy and paste it in there. So for this, everything is set up as well. I'm maybe going to give it a different name. I'm only copying the deckpack file like that. And then next, we got our publish artifact. So we are going to publish the deckpack file and the artifact so that we can use it in our release. Therefore, we don't have to configure a lot of things because this is already filled in by default. I'm just going to change the name, which will be the webinar demo. Now we have set up all the tasks. We need to add one more thing. We need to navigate to triggers on the top, and we need to enable continuous integration. You can also set it some filters in here, but as we work on the main branch, we can leave it at default. So now we can save it, save. And we can also queue it, which means we are going to start it for the first time. In here, I'm going to use the default agent pool. You can set up private pools as well. We're going to use the Visual Studio agent, and it will be targeted at our main branch. I'm going to run this. So, and this will run for about 2 minutes. So while this is running, let me just go over the task again and go over the task again and go a little bit more into detail as to why we do some configuration in here. So first, we need to generate a deckpack file for the deployment. And this deckpack file is generated for us when we build our Visual Studio solution. In here, I have added an MS build arguments to quicken up the integration because it will reduce the number of files that are generated. For example, the deploy on build tells the Microsoft build that this project needs to be packaged and deployed. The web publish method ensures we are just creating a deployment package. There are other options like publishing to a file system or somewhere else. We also do package as single file so that we put the output into a single file. The skip invalid configurations, I think it speaks for itself. And we also define the package location where that we use the integrated variable and says where it is. Next, we are going to copy the deckpack file to the artifact staging directory with the copy files. We need to do this because we have to provide our third task, the publish artifact, the artifact location. The publish artifact is our final task, and it publishes the deckpack file as a build artifact. And in the end, we enable the trigger that provides us with continuous integration. So all this makes it so that if a change is pushed to the branch, the build pipeline will be executed. So now let's have a look if it's finished already. So as you can see, it's finished. It's finished in around 1 minute and 14 seconds. And if you click on the agent job, you can see all the steps that he went through. So he starts with initializing the job, checking out our code. So he found 103 objects. He's going to build this. The most important part is that he's building our deckpack file. He's copying the deckpack file, and here is only found one file because we made there the comment that we only want deckpack files, else would be copying the 103 files. So by doing this, we can skip 102 files and quicken up the process. Next, we are going to publish our artifact. So the artifact is being published to the internal storage. We are cleaning, and then we are finalizing the job. So with the pipeline set up, we need to create a release. And I've set up some releases in here from previous stuff. So we are going to create a new release pipeline. In here, we also got some templates as well. So a lot of stuff you can do. But for the demo, yet again, we're going to choose an empty job. And then in here, we need to add an artifact. So we will be adding the artifact that we just built with the pipeline. So in the DevOps project, and we have our DevOps demo CI. So this is our pipeline, our artifact. And now with the version, again, just using the latest version of the artifact. And I'm going to add it. So now that we have selected our artifact, we also want to enable the continuous deployment on that artifact just by clicking the trigger button and then enabling the continuous deployment trigger. Next, we need to configure our task. So as you can see, we have 1 job, 0 tasks. So we need to add a task in here. I'm going to add a task. And this will be an Azure SQL database deployment. So it's an Azure SQL deckpack task. You can do more stuff than just doing the deckpack. We will see that later. But let's start with configuring it. So first we are going to select our subscription. Make sure to select the same subscription as the location of the database. So that's important that you take the same one. Next, we got our configuration of our SQL DB. So I'm going to copy these settings. Let me paste them in. It's Azure SQL DB in here. It's the webinar database. So this is our production database. We have a login. Of course, we have a password, which we don't want to reveal. So I will work with a parameter like this. And of course, if you want to use a parameter, we need to tell the pipeline that the parameter has a value. So we go to variables and add it here. So name is PW. First, make sure to set it as secret so that it doesn't show you the password. And then we just copy in the password. So now we've created a variable. We can use it in our task here. Then for the next settings, we got the deploy type, which is our SQL deckpack file. Some other options are a script file or an inline SQL script. We have some actions that we can do. We are going to publish our deckpack file, but you can also do extract, export, import. So a lot of stuff that you can do with this task. Next, we need to select our deckpack file. You can do it by just navigating to it. So you can see the linked artifacts. This one is the one we built in our pipeline. We're going to open it up, webinar demo, and here you will see the pipeline. If you, in the beginning, left everything at default and didn't specify to only copy the deckpack files, there will be a lot of files in here. So for now, we only need one. And the rest we are going to leave at default. We're just going to have a quick look at the firewall and the control options. So for the firewall, we use auto detect and delete the rule after the task ends. What does this mean? So the info button says it very good. So the IP address of the automation agent has to be added to the firewall, but also have to be deleted after it. So we're just going to leave it at default. And then for the control options, we want to have it enabled. We don't want it to continue on an error. And we can also specify a timeout. If you have 0, the job will keep running endlessly. So if you want to make sure that it times out after X minutes or X hours, you can fill it in here. So the time is specified in minutes. Okay, I'm going to also give it a name before we save it. So this is the SQL DB demo, the CD, and we are going to change it, save it. Okay. So now we are going to go back to the releases. And as you can see here, we created a new pipeline release. And for this release, we need to create an actual release. So it's very easy to set up. You just go to the create release and click the stage 1. It will be selected over here. And then you don't need to configure anything. You can just create it. So our first release has been made and it has been queued. So note that if you create one, it queues it. So it does not automatically deploy it the first time. So if you want, you can manually deploy it, or you can always go ahead and test your CI/CD with changing something and pushing it to Git. So that's what we are going to do. We are going to go to our Visual Studio project in here, and we got our tables, but let's just say I'll add a new table as well, just to test. Okay. So we have a new table in here. We're going to change everything, save everything, sorry. Next, we are going to commit our changes. So we added table 1, commit it. Then we are going to sync. We're going to push our changes to the Git repository. Voila, we successfully pushed our changes to the repository. And now we go back to our Azure DevOps. And in here, if you go to the pipelines, you can see that he just started the pipeline. So he noticed that a change was made, and with continuous integration, he automatically started it. So if we open it, you can even see the commit code for it. So we can open it, and here you can go to the agent job and see where it is. You can see what time it was committed. You can even go to the main branch and see this. You can see the changes that were made in this commit. So the trailing of this is pretty decent. I'm going to go back to the pipelines. We're going to open it. We're going to open the job. So it's running for 20 seconds now. It will take some few seconds more. So now you can see live what he's doing. As you can see, here are the building solution configuration. It says release. And for the platform, any CPU. Notice in the beginning that we didn't fill in anything. So at the default, he takes the any CPU. And now he's compiling it. He's creating a release directory. And now building our solution. So step by step, we are creating a deckpack file. As you can see, it was there again. We are copying that one file, publishing it again, and then the post job just to finalize everything. So, okay, this was a success. Status success. And now we go to the releases. And in the release, so we need to go to this one. You will see that this will start soon. So it's queued now. It's created automatically a second release. So, and it has queued this. And in a few seconds, it will turn blue and it will start executing. As you can see, it turned blue. It's in progress. And also here, we can see everything in code, how he's doing everything. So he's downloading the artifact. And after that, he's going to publish that deckpack to our database. So you can see it in code, but you can also see it in pipeline as well, where you can see that he's performing the last task, so the 3 out of 3. So also here you have a very nice trailing. So if you want to go back to the logs, you can do that as well. So he's initializing the deployment. So in here you can see all our connections. So the deckpack file to the target server. He creates a secret of the password. And then you can even see that he was creating all the files. So, and after this, we should go and check in our SQL database if everything is created. So refresh tables. And voila. As you can see, all the changes that we made are here. So the old tables and the new one is in here. So this is how CI/CD works on Azure SQL DB. Let me open up the presentation again. So I think we can conclude that when we are using automation tools such as Azure DevOps, it will reduce human error margin, and it also leads to a more maintainable project. So I feel that we need to automate our processes as much as we can. That was it for my demo. So let me go to the next slide and ask you if there are any more questions left.
Okay, I see there is already one question in the chat. I see, how can you determine yourself the moment when to deploy to test and production and not to do it instantly after the modifications are published? So I think this one is more about the Azure Data Factory. So what we did in the demo was indeed we built our release pipeline on the artifact was over there was the repository. Instead of doing it directly on the repository, you can also do it on a build. And there you can create a build pipeline also for your Azure Data Factory, where you copy the artifacts, the ARM templates that are in the ADF published branch, and then you can copy it first yourself, and that you can trigger manually, for example, and then trigger your release pipeline on the build and not on the artifacts. If you don't want to do it automatically, for example, you can also create a test plan, and then you can specify the different things that need to be there. So you can there define, okay, if the ADF published is changed, you need to do some test and validations first, and then if a specific person or specific team acknowledge that the tests are okay, that you then go to the next stage, like for example, to test or UAT or production environment. So you can really do it, but for the demonstration, we did it built on the artifacts to do it more quickly.
Okay, thank you again for the answer. Is it clear? Yes, okay. I see we got one more question. So the question is, do you think it's useful to implement CI/CD when you're still in the starting phase of going to the cloud or to the Azure cloud? And my answer to that is yes, I think it is. So I think it's the ideal moment to start implementing changes. So you're going to the new environment, and if you have the knowledge, I would advise you to do that. So I would not advise you to put all the Azure components in CI/CD, but I would advise you to put at least the code, like for example, the SQL DB or the Data Factory code in CI/CD. So it's also something that we say that we want to change if you're going to a customer and we use our A to C approach, then we advise them to change the change management and to start implementing the DevOps implementations, because it's a new way of working, and it's ideally to start when you're just going to the cloud. But of course, you need to have the knowledge. But I feel, like I said, in the end, we need to start automating as much as possible to reduce human errors. Do you think it's an answer to your question?
I agree on that too, yeah. Okay.
Okay, no more questions? No. Okay.
Doesn't seem to be, no.
Doesn't seem. Then I'll just want to say thank you for attending the webinar. So this was our last session in a series of 5 webinars. We will shortly continue with more webinars on Azure in 2021. In the meantime, you can follow our upcoming events on our website, micropoleinsight.be, and be sure to check out our academy page. That page will contain all our webinar recordings. We will also provide you with a link to the academy page in the follow-up mail. Thank you for attending the webinar.
Okay, thank you. See you, bye.